I had a toss-up of topics to close out my day of pre-recordings, but I found this one to be fairly interesting, mostly because I think it's going to be coming up very shortly once the Democrats push through everything that they're trying at the moment. The massive stimulus bill just being passed over the weekend, chief among them, and eventually we're going to get to a point that Washington D.C. statehood is going to be put in front of the Senate and the rest of Congress, if not the presidency himself. And just like H.R. 1, it is filled with unconstitutional measures that will surely get struck down by the Supreme Court. With that said, there's also several other provisions that prevent Washington, D.C. from outright becoming a state. A lot of people know the basic information, okay, but it bears going over. And especially because I'm Canadian, I don't really know much about the history of Washington, D.C. I knew it wasn't always the capital, but outside of that, why isn't it a state? How did it become a city? How did it become the capital? And we're going to go over that and why it's not likely to become a state anytime soon, because they'd have to go through and pass a constitutional amendment in order for that to happen. And guess what? That ain't happening in the Senate. So once again, rest easy that radical changes are not going to be coming in the first 2 years of this presidency, the only time it is actually going to have teeth. With Washington, D.C.'s mayor calling for a November vote on statehood. Remember, this article was also printed April 15th, 2016. So she's been pushing for it. I'm not too sure if it was Muriel Bowser in the mayor's chair at the time, but it's been a thing that they've been trying for a while. And at the same time, Washington, D.C. is anywhere from 90 to 95% Democrat voting at all times. So you know why that they'd want the additional Congress member and the 2 additional senators. First, it's worth remembering that Washington, D.C. was not always the capital. George Washington first took office in New York City. Interesting, on the land where Trump Tower is. And then the capital was moved to Philadelphia. Oh, that's where the bell is. And on his way out, he decided to crack that bell, just as a reminder that Philly needs to stay in its lane. Where it remained for a decade, Washington, D.C. was founded as a capital in 1790 as a result of the compromise between Alexander Hamilton and the northern states, and Thomas Jefferson and the southern states. Hamilton's economic policies consolidated power in the banks and financiers who primarily lived in the north, so to compromise, moved the capital physically more south to appease Jefferson and southern leaders who feared northern control of the nation. Hence why, if Hamilton had his way, it would have remained in Philadelphia, but all of his infidelity scandals came to light, which is also a prescient topic to cover as well at a future date, especially how it coincides a lot with what's going on with Cuomo right now in New York. So interesting that this gets covered right now. Anyways, but the lack of statehood for the capital is enshrined in the Constitution. Ooh, see, a little bit of a hurdle. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the document reads that Congress shall have power to exercise executive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by secession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States. James Madison, one of the most unheralded, but quite possibly one of the most important founding fathers, outlined the reasoning behind this provision in Federalist Paper 43, calling the arrangement an indispensable necessity. He wrote, "The indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulated and its proceedings interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state comprehending the seat of government for protection in the exercise of their duty might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence, equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy." Interesting how that's framed. It's also an idea that, without having previously read any of the Federalist Papers, which if you're going to be a citizen of the United States, I think also needs to be mandatory reading alongside the United States Constitution, because that cleans up a fair amount of clouded interpretation, especially with the Second Amendment, where Thomas Jefferson, if I'm recalling this correctly, was pretty much saying, yeah, feel free to own a cannon and shit. We know what we're up against. Of course, he says it a little bit more eloquently than that, but I'm just modernizing it for fun. No, but the way that Madison outlines this is that the people in the land are going to vote for the continuity of government and the expansion of government. Therefore, them being able to vote for themselves to have a bigger piece of the pie is not in the best interest for the entire country. And when I said that it votes exclusively in one direction, and it has for decades and decades, even the two modern day blowouts by Republicans, when McGovern won one state and Mondale won one state, they also won the District of Colombia. Does that say something about the voting temperament of the population of Washington, D.C.? And that was in 76 and 88, and it's not likely to change anytime soon. In other words, the founders worried if the capital were to be a state, the members of the government would be unduly beholden to it. Exactly. When the capital was officially moved to D.C., residents lost voting representation in Congress and the Electoral College, as well as say in constitutional amendments and the right to home rule. Members of the district won the victory in 1961 with the passage of the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, which granted them votes in the Electoral College. It's been abused by Democrats ever since. To this day, D.C. does not have voting representation in Congress, and the federal government maintains jurisdiction over the city. Proponents of D.C. statehood like Mayor... Oh, okay, so she was in power at the time, Muriel Bowser. There is still a long way to go, and it's going to be a long time to get there because it's going to need that 2/3 majority in the Senate and in the House in order to pass the constitutional amendment. And guess what? The numbers aren't there. It's razor thin in the House, and I couldn't even imagine some moderate Democrats, because they're more plentiful in the House. As many extremists as there are in the House, ones closer to the middle tend to populate in the House of Representatives because they have to seek re-election every 2 years. So they got to keep at least a face of bipartisanship, unless you're in deep blue districts like what Washington, D.C. would produce. And another thing, a much more recent thing, is the fact that they're setting it up like a fortress and they aren't stopping. I don't know what the methodology is any longer. Really, it's perplexing. We could engage in conspiracy theories until the cows come home, which you're not allowed to call women anymore. You've seen the video from yesterday. But it also evokes several other pieces of legislation from the past. If anyone is going to station troops in D.C., it probably should be the federal government and not any of the states in the city itself, even though they have also requested additional troops come in from, I know New York sent some, Virginia sent some. That makes sense, right? And Maryland as well. Florida, Texas, I'm pretty sure as well. They were sent from all over the country when National Guard troops were at or just about 10,000 strong. Insane, right? For absolutely nothing. But there were credible thoughts that there was something going to happen. Just like on March 4th when a family wearing MAGA caps showed up and took a picture in front of fences. Ooh, scary. In a building, an armed camp to protect themselves and the people around them, Democrats implicitly endorsed the case for D.C. remaining a federal district and not a state. Events shortly after the Constitutional Convention in 1787 influenced the framers' thinking regarding the capital. 4 years earlier, the federal government created by the Articles of the Confederation resided in Pennsylvania. That Congress didn't control any portion of the city, or even their own building. They met in Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, which they shared with the state legislature. Indeed, Confederation Congress had little control over anything, including federal revenue. States were asked to contribute to the federal government, but there is no mechanisms to make them do so if they refused or delayed, leaving the federal government chronically short of money. So, when soldiers from the Continental Army demanded the wages they had been promised during the war, Congress simply ignored them. Even if they had the will to pay, the federal coffers were empty. The Confederation Congress had no authority over states' militias in peacetime, and Pennsylvania's executive, John Dickinson, sounds like somebody who would work for the Lincoln Project, if he would call out the state militia to keep them from being killed or overthrown, Dickinson declined. The troops and the congressmen stared at each other for a while, but fortunately, no violence ensued. The congressmen exited the building and passed through the mob unharmed, save for some insults from the now drunken soldiers. Following the incident, Congress didn't wait to see If peacetime conditions would endure, they left town, assembling in Princeton, New Jersey 3 days later, and did not return to Philadelphia for 7 years. Because you cannot entrust your safety and your means to one state, because that would provide preferential treatment over that one state. And just like we seen in the previous Time article, that would also incentivize one group of people to continue to perpetuate and expand the powers of government. And if you did that in Philadelphia, while there's only, I do believe, 2 or 3 electoral votes that come out of D.C., as of right now, there are 20 in Philadelphia. And that is the difference in many of an election going back throughout history. So to speed it up to modern day, the point is Washington has plenty of law enforcement, yet because it is delegated to separate governments, branches, and agencies, Congress has reason to feel insecure. Ironically, White House, or Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, may not want to build a wall on the Mexican border. She is happy to build a fence to keep out her fellow Americans, including those who live and work in the district, which is a problem in and of itself. I don't like the fact that it's actually a city. It should just be a big corporate complex, and if you want to live in Virginia or you want to live in Maryland, that is totally your choice. Even though we've seen what happened to Virginia, which at one point was a very, very red state, and there's a chance it flips in the future, but as of right now, yeah, it's pretty blue, dude. Likewise, she and other Democrats opposed when President Donald Trump, deployed federal law enforcement to Portland after the federal property was attacked there, but troops in the streets of the capital, no problem. Yes, they were stormtroopers then, but now they are essential workers that are worthy of the highest honors when you run through and somehow distract a bunch of high school stoner dropouts, and then you get a standing ovation after the impeachment trial, which, if you recall, what was it, the Congressional Medal of Freedom was awarded to somebody with a red cape just distracting a bunch of, well, to steal a Joe Biden term, Neanderthals. One of them was even wearing a buffalo hat. Democrats might answer that there is a difference between Oregon and Arizona on one hand and Washington D.C. on the other. They would be right. A mob taking over a national wildlife refuge or even a federal courthouse does not imperil the republic in the way seizing the Capitol or the White House would, but that is exactly why the Constitution grants the federal government the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district. Exactly. So we have a constitutional argument, and we also have a modern day argument why DC is not going to be a state anytime soon. So the next time that pops up in the headlines, which I'd assume is probably going to happen before the end of the year, just rest assured, the votes aren't there. The mechanisms are in place. There is only so much damage Democrats can do. It looks pretty substantive, but so far the courts are at least holding their ground in the cases of Texas, what they're bringing forward. And when it comes to matters of Republicans flipping, even in something as contentious as the impeachment, Democrats aren't likely to get that 2/3 majority in order to pass significant legislation. So rest assured, guys. And with that said, we're going to be back to our regular scheduled programming tomorrow. Live headlines. I don't know what I missed today because, like I said, I'm recording this a couple days in advance. So who knows? Maybe the world burnt down and this is the final thing you're watching. And I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. I truly hope hell is nice. Here it's warm this time of year. With that said, I thank you all very much for the gift of your time. I've been Don Consuelo. I want you to follow your gut and get after it. Take care, everyone.